Goldman Sachs, who we are learning today has a message for you, angry Americans. Goldman says, we didn't do anything wrong. Yes, no fault for the company that insured and created, more importantly, it didn't really insure them, but created trillions in risky housing bets for its clients and then insured it with AIG. Not so bad, except for Goldman then insured that AIG would decline. In other words, they bet that AIG was not good for that insurance. So knowing that the insurance company who is insuring, in this case, your housing bonds, is not good for it, or believing that, do you raise your hand and warn the New York Federal Reserve, run by Tim Geithner, that there's a giant insurance scam brewing where AIG is insuring housing credit that it can't actually afford to pay on? Or do you just get long the fact that AIG is no good so that when it does blow up, you make some money? When the scam was exposed, of course, Goldman had created the mortgage bonds and sold them out, insured them with AIG. AIG happily collecting all the insurance money. Why wouldn't they? It's free. And then you, the taxpayer, when it was all said and done, were the sucker, paying AIG for their insurance fraud, 100 cents on the dollar, as arranged by our Treasury Secretary, now Tim Geithner, going to Goldman Sachs, the largest buyer of the insurance. Deutsche Bank and others, by the way. Goldman, by no means the only one involved with this, just very good at it. But as Goldman will have you believe, they are not guilty. How could they ever have known that this would have happened, other than the fact that they'll tell you, we knew AIG wasn't good for it, so we hedged ourselves. Like I said, why don't you raise your hand and call the New York Federal Reserve if you know there's a giant multi-trillion-dollar insurance scam being run in the credit markets? Here's the thing. Even if Goldman's story adds up, their best case scenario is that they were able to jump off of a sinking ship, take all of the life jackets, and never call the Coast Guard as the ship went down. Worst case scenario, they were aware that the ship was fragile, made the ship more fragile, drove it into an iceberg, and profited when it happened. I have no idea what ultimately occurred here, but we know that the risk transfer chain starts and ends in the same location. And just for context, Goldman is the same company that made more money than ever last year, to the tune of $13.4 billion, the year immediately following the delivery of windfall state support as arranged by a number of former Goldman Sachs executives at the Treasury. Meanwhile, other firms that had survived one depression and 2 world wars, Lehman, Merrill, Bear Stearns, out. Of course, the money helps pay for that headquarters there. That's $2.1 billion. Then there's JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon, who admits cutting access to consumer credit and canceling credit cards during a recession in response to a new piece of legislation designed to protect us from the predatory practices of banks. That's not a big shocker, honestly. We know the banks were jacking rates on everybody at the same time as they were resuming trading in those nasty unregulated derivatives known as credit default swaps. Very profitable, and it doesn't require any money, and the risk transfer goes back to you, the taxpayer. Honestly, it is a stunningly magnificent money machine if you don't mind jamming it down the throats of the government. Jamie Dimon, of course, explaining to shareholders that the bank had to jack up rates and do this to protect its bottom line, and I'm sure they did. Of course, our government happy to comply, because what does our government care about the millions of Americans who are drowning, whose same tax money is being used to support the institutions that are extracting their money? It's all legal, by the way. What a government. And then, speaking of the bailout, the Center for Media and Democracy today releasing its assessment of the total cost to taxpayers. Their calculation right now, about $4.6 trillion. Remember, each trillion is 1,000 billion. Yet you get my point, kind of. These numbers are hard to grasp. So far, $2 trillion of it hasn't been paid back by their calculation. But again, guess what is back? The money train in the financial industry, bank secrets, gambling with other people's money, and yes, record bonuses. There's plenty of money, of course, for the CEOs to pay themselves hundreds of millions of dollars in cash and stock, operating a banking system funded by you and that exploits you. Oh, and I might remind you once again that TARP Inspector General Neil Barofsky predicts Americans continue to provide the use of as much as $23.7 trillion in explicit and implicit support to the banking system on the blackmail that if we do not, it will cause a Great Depression. And yet no one in our political body wants to change that system. That strikes me a little funny. How about you? Back to the bounty. By the end, after all that abuse, the crew rose up. Captain Bligh found himself, of course, with a mutiny on his hands.
Well, what's the matter with you? What's the matter with you? Knock them down, damn you! They're coming criminal!
For Americans, you and I both know that our mutiny will be holding our government's feet to the fire on financial reform. This one, very simple. Not nearly as complicated as health care, for instance. You and I both know we need a bill that stops banks from keeping secrets where they hide risk in order to take your money. They do that with these credit derivatives. Watch Blanche Lincoln, who's going to be in charge of the derivative legislation and appears to be rather sympathetic to the bank's desire to keep secrets. We need a law that stops banks from gambling with your money, explicitly by leveraging your insured deposits and accounts, or implicitly by exploiting their too-big-to-fail status to take risks because they know you're going to bail them out if it blows up. And then one that stops the cops, the regulators at the SEC inside of our government, and the ratings agencies from being on the take from the crooks or ambitious to go to work for the crooks when they're done. But more than anything else, we need these bankers and the politicians they employ to get the message that their money party is over, and that the culture of extraction they have created is coming to a conclusion.